I'm Rebeca Seitz, and this is Right to Life. Normally I sit down here and I can fairly quickly figure out how to introduce you to what's coming. Today, I've been sitting here struggling for an hour. I think it's because my mind is still working so hard to take in all that I learned in the conversation that you're about to hear. So rather than keep struggling and delaying your access, I'm just going to let us hop right in. Listen to this. Dr. Rebeca Todd Peters from Elon University, thank you so much for coming on the Right to Life show today.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
As I have told you before we started speaking today, I have many questions about the religion of the history of religion and abortion in America, and I understand that you are the person to speak with about that. So I guess we should start with how in the world did it come to be that you are specializing in this area and understanding the intersection of religion and abortion?
Sure. So I grew up a PK. My dad was a Presbyterian minister. I was born in Florida. I was born in Tallahassee, baptized in Faith Presbyterian Church in Tallahassee. We lived in Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, South Carolina, Missouri while I was growing up. And then I went to college in Tennessee and have lived in lots of other places. But most of my life I've lived in the South. And I have been a Christian in the South. And after college, I worked for the national headquarters of the Presbyterian Church, and that was in the early 90s. And during that work with women's issues in the Presbyterian Church, one of the things that I did was sit in on the deliberations of the Problem Pregnancy Task Force that the church had at the time.
Was that the name of it? The Problem Pregnancy Task Force?
Yeah, Task Force on Problem Pregnancy and Abortion. It might have been on abortion, but it was a special task force. And that was their job, was to really think about what the denomination's stance on abortion and problem pregnancies was in, early 90s. And at the same time, I was also becoming a clinic escort. And in that space, in both of those spaces, I encountered people who said that they were pro-life and yet said things that were probably the most hateful things I'd ever heard Christians say.
Like what?
Yelling at women who were going into facilities, "You're a murderer." Putting in their faces pictures of things that they were claiming were abortions. I don't know what they were because, as I heard on your show, you helped your listenership know that 95% of abortions happen, before 20 weeks. And
95% in the first trimester.
In the first 12 weeks. And that's not what those pictures were showing. And those pictures were meant to make people feel bad and to trying to change people's minds. And, as a Christian, I believe that people should talk about their differences. And if that group of people doesn't think that women should be having abortions, then, fine, be part of a conversation. But to yell at women hateful things when they're in a moment of vulnerability, that's not what my family taught me about what it means to follow Jesus. And that's not what my understanding of what it means to be a Christian is. And so in that, I was in my early 20s and I was just gobsmacked that there were these people who also said they were Christian, who were acting in ways that were, in my mind, very unchristian. And that was really just this wake-up call for me about this issue in America.
Now, how is it that you ended up in Greensboro?
Right. So I did this work at the church, and, in my own discernment, I went to seminary. Growing up a PK, I didn't really think I wanted to serve in a church. I was really interested in theology and ethics. I ended up doing a PhD in Christian social ethics. So I'm a Christian social ethicist. And
wow, that's a cool title. You're
I'm
a
actually,
Christian social ethicist. Where did you go to seminary?
I went to seminary at Union Theological Seminary in New York.
Mm-hmm. I know
And
it.
and that was where I began to work on lots of contemporary ethical issues. I work on economic ethics, poverty. I work on sexuality ethics, which includes, reproductive health rights and justice issues. I work on environmental climate issues. And, these are the things I teach on. So I'm a college professor. I teach at Elon University. And these are the issues that I work on, these contemporary social issues, and try to help Christian communities think about them using scripture, rooted in tradition, but confronting how these issues and problems are manifesting in the 21st century. We didn't have climate crisis when the
Mm-hmm.
Bible was written. The legalization of abortion wasn't a question in biblical times.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these issues are new for us as Christians to try to figure out how to navigate. And my role as a Christian ethicist, the work that I do, is trying to help people have informed conversations, informed by social science, informed by reason, and thinking about these questions theologically in ways that make sense in our contemporary climate.
We chose not to have video as part of this show so that we could protect the anonymity of the women who share their stories. So you can't see my grin that formed while hearing Dr. Peters' words here. What she's describing is a walking out of that favorite verse of mine, Proverbs 4:7. Chase wisdom. If it costs you everything, get understanding. She's literally spending an entire career chasing wisdom and getting understanding. And then she's helping others do the same. So, of course, I took this opportunity to delve into some specifics with her. To chase for myself. Got it. Okay, so as I've shared with you, my background is Southern Baptist. That was my tradition. 40% of the country says they're Protestant, and 16 million of those people say they're Southern Baptist. So when I first started coming out of that tradition, I was shocked to look. All I knew of the Southern Baptist Convention's position on abortion was what I had been taught in my life, which really was the position they began to take in the 1980s, which I understand now was different than what it had been in the decades prior to that. So because you are much more of an expert on this than I am, what was the position of the SBC before then and then afterward?
Yeah, and I'm gonna frame that a little bit broader in terms of
Mm-hmm.
evangelicalism. Certainly, the Southern Baptist Convention is a large part of that, but the particularly the sort of white evangelical movement is broader than that umbrella as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you're familiar with Christianity Today, it's one of the sort of
Mm-hmm.
flagship magazines of the evangelical movement. In 1968, they pulled together a symposium of 25 evangelical scholars. And they wrote a statement that was then published in Christianity Today called A Protestant Affirmation on the Control of Human Reproduction. So it wasn't just about abortion, it was also about contraception. But I want to share with you some of the things that they said about abortion in 1968, this group of 25 evangelical scholars. So one of the things they said, and because I think that you're listeners are going to be surprised, I'm going to read you the quotes. This is exactly what they said. Quote, "The Bible does not expressly prohibit either contraception or abortion."
Wow. That's certainly not today's teaching.
Yeah.
Really?
Yes. So it goes on to say, I'm going to read the whole quote. "The Bible does not expressly prohibit either contraception or abortion, but it does set forth certain governing principles such as the sanctity of life, the command to multiply, and the apostolic injunction for a husband and wife to satisfy each other's sexual needs," which I found amazing.
Okay, all right. That feels a little intrusive, but okay, all right.
This is what these theologians said in 1968. But I think the most important part of that is they were very clear that the Bible doesn't expressly prohibit contraception or abortion. And it doesn't, right? That's one of the things that my work is so centered on, is just helping people understand the Bible doesn't say anything about abortion.
So what do you do with that verse in Jeremiah, which is so important to the movement, that always comes up, of before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. That's sort of one of the hallmark verses that gets cited in the pro-life. So does that not mean that it's a life before it's a life? Do you know what I mean? It's a life before birth?
Well, 25 evangelical scholars in 1968 didn't think so. I don't think so either. I mean, most biblical scholars don't think so. I mean, it's poetry. The images, what we call the womb passages, right? You could also pull in Psalm 139. These womb passages are poetry. They're trying to evoke images and to help people think imaginatively about different things, right? What's going on in Jeremiah isn't what's going on in Psalm 139, right? But specifically Psalm 139 is a poem. And in Jeremiah, you've got this poetic imagery that's being used to talk about Jeremiah's call, like how he understands why he is doing what he is doing. And so he's telling this story about his relationship with God. And I think it's quite possible to talk about our relationship with God, in many ways, as beginning in the womb, without also saying that means that every pregnancy, that passage about Jeremiah's calling means every pregnancy should be carried to term. Right? Those are two separate things.
That's what I have realized, is that if I believe that God allows for babies to be born that will die of SIDS 3 months later, or 6 months later, or 9 months later, then it's the same mindset for me, that allowing conception doesn't necessarily also require a belief that every life is meant to be 85 years or 82 years or whatever. It could be that conception was allowed so that it would end in an abortion because there were things that needed to happen in the grand plan. And that, to me, is a total mind cluster for me to start wrapping my mind around. There could be reasons for conception beyond birth.
Well, yes. And I would add, how do you think about those questions when you also realize 70% of fertilized eggs are sloughed off by the human body?
Well, and many of us have miscarriages. I mean, I've had 3 miscarriages and 2 live births. So
right.
I don't think any of those conceptions were any less legitimate than the 2 that I managed to birth into the world. They all were conceptions. And yes, like you're saying, certainly I've only had the 5 pregnancies, and I'm 46. I've had way more eggs released than those 5 eggs. So it's an interesting thing to even...
Not just the eggs, Rebecca, fertilized eggs, right? So there are 30% that are fertilized and then just never implant. There are another...
Really?
Yes, that's what I'm trying to communicate.
I missed it.
There's another 30% that fertilize, implant, and then you bleed before you ever can test that you're pregnant and know that you're pregnant. Before any pregnancy test you could even take could measure that. And then, in addition to that, there are 10% of miscarriages, right?
So there are millions upon millions of fertilized eggs that are not coming to birth anyway. And if we believe that God allowed for that conception to happen and for that sloughing off to happen, then I don't know how we then stay consistent in our beliefs if we also say, well, but if there's some sort of intervention on behalf of a human, well, somehow that's not, because even to carry that logic forward would mean that humans can't intervene in anything, or it would somehow negate God's will and God's plan. And of course, we all know, no, we're all supposed to be agents of that. That's why we're always checking our actions. So that's fascinating to me. Say that. So 30, did you say 30%?
30,
You're
30%.
blowing my mind here. 30%
Yeah.
of fertilized eggs.
Well, 30% fertilize and then just don't implant. Another 30% implant and then you bleed, you have your period before you could ever even test. So that's 60% of fertilized eggs.
Oh my goodness. See, this is what, okay. This is why I'm doing this show, because we weren't taught that in the Southern Baptist Church. You are blowing my mind. Again, I'm 46 years old. I didn't know what you just told me. And that changes completely how I think about it.
Did you know this? Or were you as in the dark as I was until this moment? 60% of fertilized eggs naturally do not come to term. 60%. If we believe that God is governing conception, then we must also believe that 60% of the time, the majority of the time, God Himself is not bringing those conceptions to birth.
So I want to go back to 1968 and these don't apologize. These evangelical scholars, because they say lots of stuff that I think is really amazing. And so I want to keep going. So they also, and this relates to our fertilized eggs, they also say, quote, "The human fetus is not merely a mass of cells or an organic growth. At the most, it's an actual human life, or at the least, a potential and developing human life." So they're saying, end quote, they're saying that this gestation, that what happens in the womb is a spectrum and it's a process. And that there's some theologians who might say that it's a full human life. And there's some theologians who are going to say that it's the potential and developing human life, right? But that it's a spectrum and that we can have different beliefs about this and all still be good evangelical scholars.
These are evangelicals that said this.
Yes, these are evangelical scholars.
That's insane, because now it's nothing but a human life. That's
right.
the only...
Right. And so, I think what's really helpful about their words and where I stand on this issue is to say abortion is a moral issue. It's not a trivial decision to end a pregnancy, but it's also, to your point, part of our free will and moral agency to be making decisions about when we have children, if we continue a pregnancy, and that when we take that decision seriously and recognize that gestating entity, what I call the prenate, is the potential for life, then we say this is a serious decision. So, I think that one of the things that is a misconception is that women make this decision. Oh, it's no big deal. Oh, I'm just going to, it's Tuesday.
I hear that a lot. Yes.
That's not what happens. So my current research project is the abortion and religion study, and I'm interviewing Protestant women having abortions across the country. And they're telling their stories. And every one of their stories is a story of moral discernment and prayer. And what am I going to do? And talking it through with God and taking it seriously. And I think that is something people need to hear.
I think that what we were taught in the movement was, abortion is for women who want to have a lot of sex and not have to deal with the repercussions. And the more women that I meet who have had abortions, whether they're Christians or not, I have yet to meet one woman. I've now met hundreds. I have yet to meet one woman
for whom it was a frivolous experience, that she did not, some of them, it was a massive loss and it was something that they simply had to choose to have the abortion. They did not feel there was any other option, so it was something they mourned. For other women, it didn't reach that extreme, but it was still not, let me go out and do this frivolous thing. It's just like going and getting an ice cream cone. I've not met any woman like that. And so it feels to me like we have certainly done women a disservice in the pro-life movement in painting abortion patients that way, patients receiving abortions that way, because it's simply not the truth. We always do a disservice to human beings when we don't operate in truth. And that is just not the truth. Not that there aren't some that, go out and try to, like I saw a few years ago, I saw a woman saying, celebrate with me about my abortion. And she was doing that in the face of extreme hate she was receiving.
Right.
And so I understood the reactionary response, but that's just not what's happening for millions of women.
Right. Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. So back to 68, right?
Yes.
So when we think about the context of what's happening in the country in 1968, why did these 25 evangelical scholars come together to even have this conversation? There are debates in the country about abortion. This is the 5 years preceding Roe v. Wade in 1973. There are increased media reports about the dangerous nature of illegal abortions, about the number of women who are dying, about the reality of, there was a German measles epidemic that caused a whole lot of very, very severe, miscarriages and severe birth defects. There was a drug called thalidomide that people were taking for, I think it was off-market use, but people were using it as a sleeping aid, not knowing it was a teratogen, meaning it was causing severe birth defects. And these were stories that were in the public media consciousness as abortion was being debated. Should we decriminalize abortion in the United States? So these scholars come together, and then, here's the end of the statement. They say there could be compelling reasons why abortion must be considered individually. So they are saying that even when we affirm the sanctity of life, we have to also acknowledge and recognize that there are sometimes compelling reasons. So then, moving forward to your actual question about the Southern Baptist Convention, in 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention passes a resolution, and again, I'm going to read you word for word. Quote, "We call upon Southern Baptists to work for legislation that will allow the possibility of abortion under conditions of rape, incest, clear evidence of severe fetal deformity, and carefully ascertained evidence of the likelihood of damage to the emotional, mental, and physical health of the mother."
Which is exactly what Roe did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So they passed, this was 1971?
Yeah.
The Southern Baptist Convention passed a resolution basically calling for exactly what the law became.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened?
Well, that was reaffirmed in 1974 after Roe was passed. It was reaffirmed again by the Southern Baptist Convention in 1976. This was a consistent message within the Southern Baptist Convention for this period of the early 70s.
So what happened?
So a little bit more. After Roe was passed, have you ever heard of W.A. Criswell, former president of the Southern Baptist Convention? He said, quote, "I have always felt that it was only after a child was born and had a life separate from its mother that it became an individual person. And it has always therefore seemed to me that what is best for the mother and for the future should be allowed." End quote.
Wow. The president of the Southern Baptist Convention basically saying it's not a human until it's separate from its mother.
Yes. Then do you know the Baptist Press?
Oh, yes. Very well.
W. Barry Garrett wrote in the Baptist Press after Roe was passed, quote, "Religious liberty, human equality, and justice are advanced by the Supreme Court abortion decision, end quote. So Baptists were really happy about Roe because it drew this clear separation line between church and state.
And they were free to practice the religion without government intrusion into the decision.
Yes.
You have to tell me how this changed. I don't, because I knew that the position was different. I mean, I wasn't ignorant of that, but I didn't know it to this degree.
Yeah. So, that question is more complicated, and it's harder to pinpoint exactly where it happens because many things happen, right? So Randall Ballmer, a scholar who has studied the religious right, makes the argument that the rise of the religious right in the late 70s, in what becomes the moral majority movement, and other sort of pieces of that movement, he argues that really evangelicals were deeply concerned about losing their tax-exempt status for parochial schools, for Christian colleges, because for many years they had said to their people, we don't take government money, so we can do whatever we want. We can say whatever we want, which is true, that they didn't take government money, but it's not true once Brown v. Board of Education was passed, once it was illegal to have segregated educational institutions and have any sort of government support. So tax-exempt status was at risk, right? Even though they weren't getting direct money, the fact that they were tax-exempt meant that they had to abide by federal laws. You follow? So the threat that they would lose their tax-exempt status really got people concerned. What are we going to do? Because we don't really want to come out and say we support segregation.
Some of them did, actually, but yes.
But in the late 1970s and early 80s, they didn't think they could mobilize voters based on that. So they were looking for an issue that would get people to the polls. And that's when they picked up abortion.
And I feel like gay rights, too, became those
Feminism,
two.
Gay rights, and abortion, sort of the trifecta of
So it was, these are the things that will mobilize our church members to go vote in our best interest, which will help protect our tax exemption. And
And this is the same time that abortion is politicized and put into a plank of the Republican Party. If you look at polling data in 1975, same time period we're talking about, right? The Southern Baptists are affirming abortion legality through 1976. If you look at polling in 1975, and that classic question pollsters ask you, do you think abortion should be legal, under any circumstances, certain circumstances, or never, right? You familiar with that one? In 1975, there is 1 point different between Republicans and Democrats. They are the same on all three of those questions. They're just in the same place. They believe the same things. It's not a partisan divide. But abortion gets picked up and put into the Republican platform to get voters to vote Republican. That's when you see the divide between Democrats and Republicans on the issue of abortion.
Wow. And I do know that informational campaign, which I guess hearing all of this was really just propaganda because it's not where the church had been before, because that's when my mother got involved and then went on to found a crisis pregnancy center. And it became just a linchpin moment in our family's life of this is when we got politically aware and politically involved.
So it tracks onto that.
Absolutely. That's when I remember my sister was in high school, which was from 1988 to 1992, when my mother had the first meeting in our living room of concerned citizens. It was a very Phyllis Schlafly Eagle Forum moment of the leaders in our community, the church leaders in our small community in West Tennessee, and saying we have to remove the scourge of abortion from our Tri-City area or the Tri-County area. And, all the statistics were flowing in of how many abortions were happening, and we have to get rid of this. And my mother just she became the leader of this movement of, we're going to start a crisis pregnancy center, and we're going to have these girls choose life. And that became the rallying cry, choose life, choose life. And then, it evolved over the years where no girl was receiving reproductive education before she received salvation education in the center. But our entire family changed to the point that we cut off some family members. My mother cut off some family members that I recently rekindled with, and they said, we just don't understand what happened with your mom. She became very different. And I said, she became political on this issue.
Yeah.
And there was no room for a conversation. Like what you were talking about earlier, there was no longer room for conversation and rationalizing and coming together. Come, let us reason together. There was no room for that anymore. It was, this is what's right. This is what we have to fight for. So it just floors me that nowhere in those conversations in my home, which I sat in as a child and then participated in as a young adult and continued to, I marched in the March for Life in DC and all that. And nowhere do I ever remember anyone saying, when did we shift on this? Why did we shift on this? Does anybody remember what we said last year about this? I don't remember any of that. So that's fascinating to me that no one went to that history.
So that's one piece of it, this piece that Ballmer describes. The other piece of it, and you know this well, you lived through it, is the really sort of what's often called the takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention, when the Southern Baptist Convention really shifted to say, we don't think women should be pastors, right? We are anti-abortion, right? There were a number of very strong declarations that shifted the convention to a much more hierarchical, patriarchal, male-centered, authoritarian structure, or authoritative structure, and much more vocally articulated gender roles than there were prior to that shift. So again, that's culturally part of what's happening with this move, is these very clearly defined gender roles that say, well, women's role is to bear children, and women's role is to stay home with those children and to care for their husbands. And that's, I mean, I have lots of friends who grew up in the Southern Baptist Church, and that wasn't what it always said. Right. That wasn't what it always stood for.
That's, if my ex-husband is listening to this,
I'm sure he is.
I was married for about 5 minutes when I was younger. It did not work for a number of reasons. And I'm thankfully married to the love of my life and have been for 20 years. But I will say this, there was a moment in that 5-minute marriage. It really was a few months. It really was less than a year. I was earning a lot of money because I had a degree and my husband did not. He was Coast Guard, and he had gotten out of the Coast Guard, and he didn't have a degree. So he was struggling to figure, to get his feet underneath him. We were young. We were early 20s. And so I was making quite a bit of money. And my mother, along the lines of what you were just talking about, because this was the decree from the SBC, came to me and she said, your marriage will never work because it will never be right with God so long as you make more money than he does. I quit my job. And I took a secretary job at a church so that I would be making less money than him. Now, what is the number one cause of arguments in marriage? Money. We fought like cats and dogs from that point forward because there was never enough money to pay the bills and do what we needed to do to enjoy our lives together. It was just an argument from that point forward. And there I was wrestling with, why is my marriage getting worse and worse when I'm being obedient to what I'm being taught by my church, which is I shouldn't make more money than him because that puts me in some sort of authority over him. And I'm I'm the head of the household, not him, because I'm having a career and he's not. And so when I realized too, again, that no, that was a shift in the church because the church was deciding to take some different political stances and put the entire denomination behind those, one of those being a woman being subservient to a man and being a helpmeet. That just, it literally cost my marriage. It got bad. It got very bad. It was just, and I look at it now, with the hindsight that I have now of having left that movement and just go, wow, that was a really poor decision, Rebecca. You should have known better. But I think that's how we have to, especially to my friends who listen to this, who are still in the movement, we really have to take a step back from the doctrine and the denominational teaching to go, does that make sense with the idea of a loving God? Does it?
Right.
Because I think if I had done that, I would have been like, no, I don't think it does. I think maybe no. So let me ask you, we've talked about the Southern Baptist a lot just because that's where I came from, but was this also, I know this was a Protestant thing, but was this also a Catholic thing happening? What was their history?
Sure. So, I mean, the Catholic Church's history is the history of Christianity too, right? So it's also,
Right.
it encompasses Protestant history. If we want to talk about sort of in the development of these ideas from sort of day one, right? The beginning, when we think about this question of how we even define what it means to be pregnant, like, and the questions around when does life begin, or, how do we think about these questions and how have we thought about them historically, right? So when we look at the history of Christianity and we think about pregnancy, that moment when you can first feel movement in a pregnancy.
Yes, I remember it well. It was like having a butterfly.
Yes. Yes. So that's called quickening. In human history, pregnancies weren't confirmed until quickening. Because how would you know if you were pregnant? If you couldn't, you might have an illness, you might have, your stomach might be upset. I mean, like, there's no way that you knew before sort of all the scientific, medical tools that we have now. Without those things, really the only definitive confirmation was when you could start feeling the movement in the womb. So it was quite common for theologians to talk about quickening as the moment of ensoulment.
Ensoulment meaning when the soul attached to the life.
And so prior to quickening, if you did something to try to end a pregnancy, it was discouraged, but it wasn't a mortal sin. And mostly it was discouraged in the Catholic tradition because the Catholic understanding of sex is that the purpose of sex is procreation. So any kind of sexual activity that interferes with the possibility of the birth of a child is considered sinful. So ending a pregnancy, like taking herbs to try to end a pregnancy, if you thought you were pregnant, even if it hasn't been confirmed, if you're just trying to sort of bring on your menses, right? And you might take a tea or something to try to do that, not even knowing whether you were pregnant or not. But if you did happen to prompt or promote an abortion, the Catholic Church would have said you were interfering with that because the purpose of sex is procreation. But again, that idea of the purpose of sex being procreation relates to any sexual activity. So you aren't supposed to have sex when you're menstruating, right? You aren't supposed to have any kind of sex that doesn't involve, how explicit.
I'll say it, no oral. No hand jobs.
Exactly. You say it. You can't do those things, right? This is also why, specifically male to male, sexual encounters are, again, quote unquote, prohibited by these theologians because they're perceived as interfering with what is the purpose of sex. So that idea of what the purpose of sex is changes for Protestants. Protestants are able to affirm, and in that 68 statement, they say this as well, right? That the evangelical theologians say this as well, that sex is also about our relationship with our partner, and it's about our care for each other, and it's about how that intimacy helps us grow and build our love and our life together. But in the early church, in specifically sort of the history of the Catholic Church, this idea about quickening and ensoulment happening, and right, that happens at the third or fourth month. So to go back to your data that you've been educating your audience about, that's after 95%
of abortions
have happened. So the history of the Catholic Church, the history of the Christian Church, isn't to prohibit or to mark those early abortions as sin, certainly not as murder, because this idea that life, quote unquote, begins at conception is a very modern idea.
So where did that people can't see me because we don't have video, but my mind is just a little blown. So where did we as the church begin to parrot the phrase that you just said, life begins at conception?
Yes. So just to finish the Catholic Church.
Oh, sorry.
Which relates to this. It's not until 1965 that the Roman Catholic Church shifts their concern from concealment of sexual sin, right? You're not doing sex right because you're not allowing for procreation. So that, or the other fear is that women will have abortion, like unmarried women who get pregnant are trying to conceal their sexual sin by having an abortion, right? So up until 1965, the Roman Catholic Church's prohibition against abortion is for the concealment of sexual sin. It's not till 1965 that shifts over to the protection of life. So you see what I'm saying?
Wow, thousands of years. And they're like,
history isn't about protecting life. That's a modern idea. So I think that begins in the mid 19th century when abortion is legal. Well, it's not criminalized. We have a big movement in the mid 19th century to criminalize abortion, and it's led by physicians. It's actually called the Physicians' Campaign to Criminalize Abortion. And what you have happening is they're all Christian doctors in this Victorian era who are this coincides with the invention of the microscope, so the ability to begin to see fertilization happening in cells, and the recognition of the continuity that happens from a fertilized egg to, through gestation. Before this, through autopsies and other means, people knew about how gestation happens, but they couldn't get back to the cellular because it was too small, right? They couldn't see that. So the microscope sort of opens up that window into those earliest stages. And these doctors start to say, well, because this is a continuous development, there's no point at which this isn't a baby. And therefore, women who are having abortions don't know what they're doing. And if we just tell them what they're doing, they'll understand how wrong they are. So you see echoes of contemporary legislation that is labeling women as stupid, right? The scripts that some states say you have to read to women about what they're doing as if they don't understand that when they schedule an abortion, they're going to end their pregnancy. They have to read you the script. So you have to understand this. The parallels from that go back to the 19th century, to these doctors who think women are so dumb that they don't understand what they're doing. And they're meaning these physicians, frustration, exasperation, just plain upsetness about women controlling their fertility. And women in the 19th century often had as many or more abortions as they had children. Abortion was used by women to, not because they didn't want to have children, but they wanted more years between their children. So they wanted to space their children farther apart. So did you know that our fertility is about 35 years?
Yes.
If you are trying to manage your fertility over a 35-year period, you can have so many children during that 35 years. And that was hard, right? Women died frequently in childbirth. Women had, many, many children. If you look at sort of the colonial era, the birth rate is up to like 8, 9, 10. And then by the mid 19th century, it's dropped to 3 or 4. So how did it drop that much in 100, 150 years? It dropped because women were seeking all the ways they could to space out their children longer. So that was abstinence. That was longer time breastfeeding. That was abortion. And they were managing all of these tools that they had to not have as many children, because it's hard on your body, it's hard economically. We know all of the ways that so many children is or can be a challenge. And so this move to reduce the number of children they had regularly involved abortion as a way of managing their fertility. And the doctors didn't like that. And the doctors didn't like, even more than women managing their own fertility, the fact that they were using midwives. Because if you use a midwife to help you deliver your baby, when that baby gets sick, you're likely to call that midwife. You're not calling the doctor. Doctors wanted to be doing medical care for those families. And so they were trying to figure out how to cut the midwives out. How do we get control of the health care of these families? And all of these reasons or sort of pieces of this puzzle are documented in terms of what was happening in this physicians' campaign to criminalize abortion.
So the physicians' campaign to criminalize abortion, those were Christian doctors?
Yeah. When you read their language, they talk about the Christian duty of women to mother, right? Christian language is all through their speeches, through the documents that they're preparing. And it's all about women's responsibility as Christian women to bear children.
So it was this idea that a woman's purpose is to be a wife and a mother. And who was the football player that reminded us of that a few months ago in the commencement speech, that's our highest and greatest call. And while I do adore my children and I love being a wife, it was interesting to hear that somehow I'm supposed to value that more than the thousands of people that I have gotten to help and work with in my 20-year career in this business, and the hundreds of good messages and stories that I've put out into the world and made the world a better place. I don't know why we have to put those into a hierarchy in the first place. Why can't I love being a mother as much as I love being a storyteller and a story, to use your word, a story midwife of helping to bring stories into the world? Yeah. There's not a need for a woman to have that competition within herself, to be valuing more of a part of her than another part of her. She can be all these things at once. She's capable of being all of these things at once and equally, and they can all be equally important. So that's interesting to me that there was a physicians movement, the physicians being motivated by the concept that no, women need to be wives and moms before and to the exclusion of anything else. So, of course, we have to make it where they have to give birth every time they get pregnant. Whether or not they can afford to feed those children or house those children or clothe those children, that's somebody else's problem.
Yes. And, so prior to this mid-19th century campaign, women were having abortions. Women have always had abortions. We have some of the early written documents. There's Egyptian papyri that have recipes for how to end a pregnancy.
Wow. Yeah. Women were like, we will figure this out.
Yes. So before married women in the mid-19th century start using abortion as one of their tools to manage their fertility, you largely had poorer women, sometimes, more single women who were having abortions. And most of society just sort of turned away, right? They didn't, okay, these women are managing, it's not our concern. It was the fact that married women were using abortion to control their fertility that became the sort of, I don't know, trigger for these physicians. And they were able to use that as a cultural tool that if only these married women understood what they were doing, they would stop. And they went across the country and state by state passed the laws. Those are the laws that we saw after Roe that came back into effect. After Dobbs, when Roe was overturned, you saw these laws from the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s come back on the books, and different states handled them in different ways. But that's the origin of the criminalization of abortion in the country.
The laws that came back on the books are these laws from the 1800s that were rooted in the motivation of a married woman needs to give birth every time she gets pregnant, period.
Yeah.
And if she...
It was the very beginning of the American Medical Association as they were professionalizing and they were trying to stake out their claim as the authorities in medicine. So it was a combination of what you just described, right? Sort of it's kind of like how the evangelicals used abortion to mobilize people to go to the polls, right? The physicians found this issue that had political capital and they used it to promote their professionalism and authority. Because if you wipe out all the midwives, if you wipe out all the other people who are your competition, then you're there with the power and the authority.
And of course, none of those good Christian physicians were females, I'm sure, in that organization.
But we have records from, and not all the physicians, certainly. There was a group of people who took this on as their campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's the same era as the Comstock laws, right? The Comstock laws are the ones that forbid any kind of mailing of information about contraception or any mailing of contraceptive devices as immoral. And so all of these ideas around controlling women's fertility and sexuality are being shut down by these male authority figures. And those Comstock laws, they're talking about using those to prohibit the mailing of medication abortions today.
I just wonder, did it ever once occur to all of these male physicians to simply tell their fellow male counterparts, if you don't want your woman to be pregnant, don't have sex? Like, could any shred of responsibility ever rest with? It's not like we're out here fertilizing eggs by ourselves. It takes both of us. And I don't understand. I didn't understand even when I was in the movement, but I don't understand still to this day, the just complete absolvement of even a percentage of responsibility on the male in the equation. It's just the woman's thing that she has to deal with. And so we say to the woman, you have to manage this, but we are also going to control what options you have to manage this. Let me ask you this. We've done Protestants, we've done Catholics. What about our Jewish friends?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to talk about, lots of other faith traditions. Certainly, it's important to talk about our Jewish friends. So within Judaism, the predominant understanding of when life begins is when the first breath is taken. And that goes back to, Genesis 2.
Very Genesis, yeah.
And God formed man from the dust of the earth and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And then, Adam, man, became a living nephesh. That nephesh, that's the Hebrew word for breath of life. And that, when you have that breath of life, that's when you become human. That's when you enter into personhood with human rights and all that entails. So for Jews, life begins at birth, and they also have very clear teachings in, the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, but the Hebrew Bible or the Torah, in Exodus. There's this classic story in Exodus 21 about when two men fight and they accidentally strike a pregnant woman. It's in a whole list of all of these sort of penalties. What happens if she miscarries? Well, it's very clear in the text that if she miscarries, the penalty is different than if she dies. So if she miscarries, whoever struck her and caused the miscarriage is required to pay recompense to the father, right? It has nothing to do with the pregnant woman.
With the mother.
It goes to the man. But if she dies, then the law of lex talionis, an eye for an eye, which was the ancient Near East law of if you kill someone, then their life is required. And so that eye for an eye doesn't come into play if you cause a miscarriage. There's just a fine.
So I just want to make sure I'm digesting what you're saying. In Jewish tradition, ending whatever is happening in the womb, which Southern Baptists call life, is not ending a life because it's not receiving the penalty for ending a life, which is eye for an eye. And that is the penalty that applies if you end the woman's life, even though we were property.
Yeah, right.
But that is a very I didn't realize that. And I've,
So it shows a distinction between that gestating, prenate.
The potential.
Yeah. And recognizes, yes, that was bad, right? You shouldn't have.
There is a loss.
There is harm done. There is a loss. But the penalty helps us recognize that it's not valued. It's valued. It's not valued in the same way.
As a human life.
That's right. And I think that has informed my work on this issue, because I think it's really helpful. I don't agree with secular feminists, and not a lot of secular feminists say this, that the idea that it's like cutting your hair, right? An abortion is like cutting your hair, or
yikes.
Sort of like, it's like, well, that it's part of your body and you can do whatever you want with it, right? It's a clump of cells. It doesn't matter. I do think, like I said earlier, it's a moral issue. It is the potential for life and therefore must be taken seriously as a decision. But that doesn't mean you can't make the decision, because there is...
Oh, that's an important distinction.
Yeah. Because there is that difference between the potential for life and an actual life. So we respect the potential for life. And again, like I told you, the women that I interview they're thinking carefully. They're thinking about, what would it mean if I had this pregnancy, if I continued this pregnancy? What would it mean for the children that I already have that I'm struggling to feed? Some of the women say to me, I can't even take care of myself. How could I possibly be responsible for another human being? I would be a terrible parent right now. I want to be a parent someday. But that is respecting the potential for life, right? To say, I would be a terrible parent.
That's interesting to think of the impact of the potential on becoming a human is respecting the potential life, to think about what's coming. We do that in everything else in life, right? We make decisions for our children because we can think through the repercussions, and they can't. They don't have fully formed frontal lobes. I tell my teenagers all the time, you can't do it. You can't do it yet. It's okay. It's why you have me.
Yes.
To think about the fact that we do that before they're born as well. And that is respecting, that is a mother respecting the potential of that life, to think about, what if I actually allow it to become human life and be born? It's a very different way of looking at the woman than she's just having an abortion because she had too much sex and doesn't want to.
There was one of the women we interviewed, Sierra, 28-year-old nurse, has a 3-month-old and a 1-year-old. And she said,
oh, God love her.
I know. Pregnant. And she said to us, the selfish choice would have been to have that baby. Because I need to take care of those 2 kids I already have. And as much as I might have liked to have had a third, and I know I would have loved it, that wasn't the thing I needed to do to take care of the 2 children I already have.
There's so many things to think through. Again, I go back to, we have to consider that as women when we're pregnant. And I don't understand why the government needs to have a presence in that deliberation.
Yeah, I think you really honed in on the central issue here, is that if we can all acknowledge that these are factors that people are navigating, everybody's situation is unique to them. The only person who has full knowledge is that person. And why is the state intervening? Why does the state think that's a good idea to tell people, what they can and can't do in those situations? And this is the other, I want to share another really important piece of this study. And that is the women we interview who say, yeah, abortion is a sin. What I did was a sin. And I prayed about it, and God forgives sins. Right? And it's such a revelation to me to hear these women say, yeah, that's a sin and God forgives sins. And I've prayed about it and God and I are good. And the state has no role in that because it's between me and God.
It goes back to that idea of perhaps that was the purpose of that conception. Because, to go through that process in your relationship with God of wrestling through that and working through that in that relationship, you certainly have a different relationship with God afterward because you've wrestled through that with God. And who's to say that wasn't the purpose? I don't think it's the state to say that wasn't the purpose. It just, when I started the show, I still have it to a certain extent. It is a true, how do we think about this? Because, you're not in Florida, but we have this amendment that we have to vote on this November. And I am a pro-life person. I do value life. I do nurture life. And I really do want to make a decision that, set politics aside, set religion aside, at the end of the day, does my decision protect and nurture life? And the first thing I had to come to terms with was I was not taught to factor in the life of the woman, only the potential life within her. And so I really had to wrap my mind around the audacity of forgetting that there was another human being, an actual human being involved in this that was going to be affected by this decision. But now even coming to that place of when you recognize that every woman is faced with different circumstances with every pregnancy and is factoring in her circumstances, is in many ways knowing she's making a moral decision from what you're telling me of the women that you're talking to, and feeling like the government should have the audacity to have a word in that internal conversation she's having, and maybe with her partner and maybe with her God. It feels very arrogant on the part of the state to insert itself into that deliberation, to remove anything, basically, because she has to live with it in her faith, in her family. Her family has to live with it.
And I think what we're seeing in these state legislatures is it's predominantly male Christian legislators who are promoting these bills and voting for these bills. In South Carolina, there were these women legislators in all the women legislators in South Carolina, Republican, Democrat, Independent, voted together to say, you men need to stop this because this is not the state's role. So, I think they were this amazing. They all got voted out. Well, the Republicans got voted out.
Dr. Peters is referencing 3 Republican state senators from South Carolina: Katrina Shealy, Sandy Senn, and Penry Gustafson. They joined Democrat Margie Bright Matthews and Independent Mia McLeod in filibustering South Carolina's near-total ban on abortion and halting its passage 3 times. For those efforts, Shealy, Senn, and Gustafson lost their party's primaries. They've also faced threats and harassment.
But it was such a witness to just what you were talking about, right? That this is not something that the state should be intervening in, and men don't always get that because women who can get pregnant have a different understanding of the complexity of what that means and how you are situated in your life circumstances and how you navigate that, and recognize that even if it's a choice you wouldn't make, other people should have the free will, right? To use Christian language, to do that. God gave us free will. And, as my interviewees remind me, God gave us free will. And sometimes we make decisions that God doesn't like, but God still gave us free will. And that's, again, between us and God.
I will say, I've said it before on the show and I'll say it again, when we're in a voting booth, our pastor's not there, our husband's not there, The other kids aren't, it's just us. It's just us in a voting booth marking those ballots. And that it's just us that has to answer for how we mark that ballot. And the more that I learn about this issue, I'm comforted by the fact that we women will stand alone in those voting booths, and we will have to decide what's the thing here that really does protect life and really does nurture life, a woman's life, a family, her relationship with God. Is it giving her the ability to walk her own journey out? Or is it saying, no, you can't? The state gets to tell you that you can't. You can't make those choices. The state knows better your circumstances. It's been a really enlightening conversation. Well, Dr. Peters, thank you so much for coming on to Right to Life. I have certainly been schooled and educated today. I really appreciate the information. I say often on this show, my favorite verse is Proverbs 4:7, which is chase wisdom. If it costs you everything, get understanding. And I certainly got some today. So thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
The thing about chasing wisdom is that you have to be willing to live within it when you catch it. That's the rub. The verse says, chase wisdom and get understanding. Understanding is the act of incorporating the wisdom into your being so that it becomes a part of your knowledge. You begin to move from a place of understanding. It's a little like when we're kids and we first touch a hot stove. That's how I think about it. That pain when we touch the hot stove, that's wisdom. We now know the stove can bring pain under certain circumstances. We show that we understand this new wisdom by adjusting our behavior around the stove. We no longer lay a hand on it without a thought. We tap it, that fast tap we do, or we toss a bit of water on it and see if the water sizzles. Those acts, that's our understanding at work. Today, talking to Dr. Peters, a Christian social ethicist who is deeply rooted in studying the intersection of abortion and faith, we chased wisdom. This discussion was chasing wisdom, and we caught some. The question now, for you and for me, is whether or not we'll move that wisdom into understanding.
You've been listening to Right to Life on the 1C Story Network. If you have a story to share or would like to learn more, please visit righttolifestories.com. This show is brought to you by the generous support of people who value life. To contribute, visit righttolifestories.com or get in touch.
The 1C Story Network, for the love of stories.